Dear listener, before the story begins, I ask you to subscribe to my channel. This is the best motivation at the start. And we are starting. I'll share with you the story of my life. My wife and I have been married for 4 years. Everything was wonderful. Just an ordinary existence like so many other people in families experience. I had a job, my spouse was employed, and we didn't have children yet. My wife and I are both 30 years old. Life was good for us. And I'll be honest, we always spent time together. If we indulged in a drink, it was always in each other's company. Overall, it was a happy and content marriage. I was no longer head over heels in love, didn't frequent clubs, never strayed, and always spent the night at home. Our plans for the future included having a baby and renovating our 3-room apartment where we resided. One fateful day, we were at a friend's place, unwinding and enjoying ourselves, imbibing in moderation. We returned home in the middle of the night. I retired to bed, but my wife mentioned she would stay up a bit longer before joining me. I didn't give it much thought as I had complete faith in her. I woke around 8 in the morning and noticed my wife was absent. I ventured to the computer room and found her seated at the desk, typing on the keyboard. Upon seeing me, she abruptly began closing all the windows on the screen, which immediately caught my attention. I inquired about her activities. She responded, "Oh, I was merely browsing the internet, perusing various trivial matters." A short while later, she went to bed. But I waited for an opportunity to access the computer and examine the history of visited websites. It was incredibly perplexing to me what someone could be doing online until morning and what kind of news could be so captivating. What I discovered left me stunned. She had visited a site called Male Dating or something similar, and had begun sending messages to several men. The men replied with their own responses. While not everything worked out with everyone, one guy provided an adequate response and they initiated a correspondence. The entire conversation revolved around sex, or more specifically, discussing it. Then, my wife wrote, "Yes, intimacy with my husband simply doesn't inspire me." I was utterly astounded. They proceeded to exchange photographs and even plan to meet, selecting a location, but then he departed, and it remained unresolved. The very fact that she, a married woman, openly wrote such things to a stranger left me in a state of bewilderment. I didn't hesitate. I immediately went and woke her up, showing her everything. She stared at it for an extended period, feigning ignorance, and then started pleading for forgiveness, saying, "I was intoxicated," and so on. I just crave communication. I contemplated the situation for a long time, wanting to kick her out, but the fact that she was under the influence and that it was virtual communication played a role. Women sometimes entertain themselves in such ways. Ultimately, I convinced myself to believe her. I forgave her, and we continued living together. I gradually began to forget about the incident, but the trust had already been shattered. Subconsciously, I started anticipating something similar to happen again. Approximately 5 months passed when another incident occurred. My wife had started a new job about 4 months prior. One evening after work, I was sitting at the computer, possibly playing poker, when my wife was beside me, messaging someone on Skype using her phone. I asked who it was, and she replied, "With a girlfriend." I accepted her answer, but decided to verify it that evening. I chose to inspect her phone and found her dialogue with a girlfriend, but it was surprisingly brief considering she had been corresponding for at least 2 hours. I noticed that my wife began rushing to the computer more frequently and constantly communicating on Skype. The history was purposely not saved, which raised my suspicions. Moreover, there were instances when I would abruptly enter the room, and she would immediately start clicking the mouse and hurriedly closing something. I became seriously intrigued. I installed a spy program on the computer that recorded all keystrokes and captured screenshots of the screen. I set it up and started giving my wife access to the computer while I waited. Sometime later, having come home early, I decided to utilize the program and see with whom she was messaging and about what. It was a complete disaster. The correspondence was with a male colleague from work and had been ongoing for about a month. This jerk was the head of a department at her workplace. They communicated on Skype, both at work and outside of it. At that moment, he was hospitalized. In the correspondence, my wife used phrases like, "How I miss you," "How I long to kiss you, my kitty," and so on. Reading it was pure agony. I started waiting and gathering information. Every day behind my back, while I was asleep or in the shower, she would write something to him, or he would write to her. Furthermore, she wrote to him, I can't respond now. My husband frequently enters the room. This meant he was aware that she was married, and it wasn't concealed. Lovely. One evening, I went to a friend's house for a beer. I returned home around 1 in the morning and turned on the computer. It was still ongoing. In their correspondence, they discussed how she planned to visit him in the hospital and how much she missed him. I couldn't tolerate it any longer. My wife, whom I loved so deeply, was shamelessly lying to me behind my back without an ounce of remorse. My wife was asleep. I approached her and miraculously restrained myself from striking her. The rage was overwhelming, further amplified by alcohol. I yanked off the blanket and shouted, "Get up!" I then led her to witness the evidence of her personal life. "Where did you obtain this?" was her initial response. She began explaining that they met at work, but about 2 months ago, he started pursuing her, and she yielded because I allegedly didn't give her enough attention. It's all so cliché. She claimed that nothing transpired between them, that he attempted to kiss her a couple of times in the subway, but she supposedly evaded him. I simply couldn't believe it all. It felt like it couldn't be true, that it was some kind of absurdity. But alas, this is the reality of life. Our marriage was crumbling right before our eyes. I then ran around the apartment shouting something and demanded that she pack her belongings and leave my house. She departed, taking a few items with her. I must tell you, she didn't really offer many excuses. Most of the time, she remained silent. There were no tears or genuine remorse from her. That very day, I logged into her Skype account and began writing to this guy, pretending to be her. He seemed to catch on immediately. Apparently, she had already informed him. This guy turned out to be married with a 3-year-old daughter. However, he assured me that it was all a misunderstanding and merely flirting. Nothing more. Out of pity, he started writing that he was unaware she was married. I had screenshots of their correspondence and a wealth of intriguing information for his wife, which I indeed shared with her within a few days after locating her. About 2 weeks passed, and I was living alone. My wife called, expressing her desire to talk. We had a conversation. I had already calmed down by then. She started seeking forgiveness, admitting it was a mistake, that this jerk was ignoring her, and that she deeply regretted her actions. I didn't trust her, but for some reason, I forgave her. The question that tormented me was whether they had been intimate or not. Ultimately, I once again forgave her like an idiot. I just apparently love her and understand that this relationship will never succeed. The pain has subsided, but the residue remains. Now, I constantly live under stress. I forgave her, but I can't and don't want to trust her anymore. I incessantly check her phone. I have developed paranoia with all its consequences. I don't want to live like this anymore. I'm simply searching for a reason to send her away forever, get divorced, and start anew. That's the story. A cry from the heart. Remember when I mentioned going to my friend's house for a beer? Well, he briefly shared his life story with me, and I probably should have done the same. Now I will narrate it in the first person. I'm 31, and my wife is 26. We've been married for 5 years and have a son. I have 2 companies, a job, a car, and an apartment. I would have continued working. Everything was going well. Naturally, I provided for everything. I loved, lived, and worked for my family. Of course, I worked a lot, typically until 8 p.m. with 1 day off. I always strived to give attention to my wife and son. I envisioned a happy future together until death. We wanted to have a second child. 5 months ago, I discovered that she was unfaithful. I had never even contemplated cheating myself. It feels like they spat on your soul, burned it, leaving only emptiness. For 2 weeks, I lived as if in a terrible nightmare. I stayed with my parents. Then, after 2 months, I met an incredibly lovely girl. The most crucial aspect is that I was able to gather myself for a new relationship. Now I am a transformed individual, and so far everything is going well for me. My girlfriend is an absolute fairy tale, intelligent and beautiful. I've never experienced sex like I have with her. Sometimes it seems that fate is mocking me. Everything that my ex lacked, I find in this new person. I drew conclusions, sent my wife far away, despite loving her deeply and accepting all her flaws, and started anew with someone who surpasses my ex in every way. Of course, my wife sought forgiveness, but I cannot live with a traitor. I even slept with her once after the infidelity, but realized that nothing could be restored.